The Japanese imperial family, Hirohito's uncle Prince Asaku, under whose command the kill all captives order was forged, also escaped justice, exempting him from having to appear at the IMF at all. The decision to give Hirohito immunity from war responsibility, and still worse, the decision to keep him on the throne, later impeded the Japanese people's own historical awareness of their World War II crimes. According to Herbert Bix, a biographer of Hirohito and prominent Japan scholar, many would find it difficult to believe that they had been accomplices in aggression and murder on a near genocidal scale, when the emperor, whom they had served so loyally, never had to bear responsibility for his own speech and actions. MacArthur helped prepare the ground for future Japanese conservative interpretations of the post-war monarchy that denied the Showa emperor had ever held real power. The details of Emperor Hirohito's role in the Rape of Nanking remain a controversial subject because of the dearth of primary source material available. Unlike the Nazi government records, which were confiscated and microfilmed by the Allies, and later used as evidence in war crimes trials, the Japan has deliberately destroyed, hid or falsified most of their secret wartime documents before General MacArthur arrived. Even most of the Japanese high-level military records that the American occupation forces did manage to seize in 1945 documents, which one professor called a priceless historical treasure, were inexplicably and irresponsibly returned to Japan by the American government little more than a decade later before they could be properly microfilmed. For these reasons, it is practically impossible today to prove whether Emperor Hirohito planned, approved of, or even knew of the atrocities in Nanking. Perhaps the only English-language book that has attempted to explain Hirohito's involvement in the Nanking Massacre is Japan's Imperial Conspiracy by David Bergamini. In his book, Bergamini claims that the Japanese laid out an intricate blueprint for world conquest, and that the person who made the decision to invade Nanking was Hirohito himself. Bergamini offers a riveting narrative, complete, apparently with quotes from Japanese top-secret messages, to explain the chain of events leading to the tragedy at Nanking. Unfortunately, Bergamini's book was seriously criticized by reputable historians, who claimed that he cited sources that simply did not exist, or quoted mysterious unnamed informants who said amazing, but unverifiable things. Adding to the confusion is the debate among scholars on whether a Japanese imperial conspiracy to conquer the world had ever existed. For years it was believed that Prime Minister Tanaka Giichi had submitted a secret report to the throne. In the Far Eastern Conference of 1927, a report known as the Tanaka Memorial that purportedly encapsulated Japanese ambitions at the time. In order to conquer the world, we must first conquer China, the report allegedly dictated. But in order to conquer China, we must first conquer Manchuria and Mongolia. If we succeed in conquering China, the rest of the Asiatic countries and South Sea countries will fear us and surrender to us. Then the world will realize that Eastern Asia is ours, and will not dare to violate our rights. This is the plan left to us by Emperor Meiji, the success of which is essential to our national existence. Today, this report is generally considered by scholars to be a forgery, one with possible Russian origins. But when the memorial first emerged in Peking, in September 1929, it led many to believe that Japanese aggression against China was part of a well-coordinated Japanese plot to conquer the globe. The English text of the Tanaka Memorial later appeared in English in a Shanghai newspaper, and even inspired the classic Hollywood movie Blood on the Sun, in which James Cagney attempts to steal Japan's master plan in order to save the world. Today the Tanaka Memorial still has a considerable grasp on the world imagination. Many Chinese historians believe that the Tanaka Memorial is authentic, and Chinese encyclopedias and dictionaries, as well as English-language newspaper and wire service articles, continue to cite the memorial as historical fact. Currently, no reputable historian of Japan believes that there was a pre-planned conspiracy by Japan to conquer the world. An examination of the chaos in the Japanese state administration in the 1920s and 1930s suggests that such a conspiracy was unlikely. The Japanese army hated the navy. The high command in Tokyo didn't know what the Kwantung army in Manchuria was doing, until it was too late, and relations between the foreign ministry and the armed services were often chilly to the point of silence. However, many scholars believe that Hirohito must have known about the rape of Nanking. Herbert Bix personally thinks it is inconceivable that Hirohito could not have known. First, it was front-page news in the world press. Sec Judgment Day 179. Only his own brother could have told him the gory details. Back in 1943, Prince Mikasa Takahito, the youngest brother of Emperor Hirohito, spent a year as a staff officer at the Nanking headquarters of the Japanese Imperial Army's Expeditionary Force in China, where he heard a young officer speak of using Chinese prisoners for live bayonet practice in order to train recruits. It helps them acquire guts, the officer told the prince. The appalled Mikasa described the practice as truly a horrible scene that can only be termed a massacre. Out of a desperate desire to bring the war to a close, the prince distributed a questionnaire to young staff officers to seek their opinions about the war, prepared a lecture that denounced Japanese aggression in China, and wrote the report Reflections as a Japanese on the Sino-Japanese War. The paper was deemed controversial and dangerous, but Mikasa got away with writing it because of his royal blood. The Japanese military later confiscated and destroyed most of the copies, but a single copy survived, and it was later discovered in the microfilm collections of the National Parliamentary Archives. If this story had come out during the Japanese war tribunals, it might have implicated the royal family and military command alike for their failure to crack down on war criminals when news of misdeeds reached them. Mikasa admitted that he reported on the China situation in bits and pieces to his brother the emperor, and even watched with him a newsreel about Japanese atrocities in China. But Mikasa's confession did not emerge until 1994, almost half a century after the inf. We will probably never know exactly what news Hirohito received about Nanking as the massacre was happening, but the record suggests that he was exceptionally pleased by it. The day after the fall of the Chinese capital, the emperor expressed his extreme satisfaction to Prince Kanan, the grand-uncle of the empress, and chief of the army general staff, and the prince, in turn, sent a telegram of congratulations to Matsui Iwane. Not since history began has there been such an extraordinary military exploit. Hirohito even invited Matsui, Osaka and Yanagawa to his summer villa to present them with silver vases, embossed with the imperial chrysanthemum. In the end, the royal family not only escaped scrutiny at the tribunal, but went on to enjoy lives of leisure and national adoration. Prince Osaka, for one, retired to watch weekly newsreels with Hirohito, to sit with him on the Council of Princes of the Blood, and to play golf with him until the end of his days. Osaka not only excelled at the sport but took an active interest in golf course development, becoming the architect of the Plateau Golf Course at the Daihakone Country Club in the resort town of Hakone on the east coast of Japan. Hirohito himself lived peacefully and in dignity until his death in 1989. 9. The fate of the Sub-Zero/IVAF. More than one scholar of the Nanking Massacre has commented upon the dismal manner in which justice was doled out after the inf. While many of the Japanese who tormented the Nanking citizens received full military pensions and benefits from the Japanese government, thousands of their victims suffered and continue to suffer lives of silent poverty, shame, or chronic physical and mental pain. The pivotal moment in this reversal of justice came with the advent of the Cold War. The United States had originally sought to implement democracy in Japan by purging Japan's leadership of people involved in the war. But after the war, the Soviet Union broke its promises at the Yalta Conference and seized Poland and part of Germany. As the Iron Curtain of communism descended on East Europe, so did a bamboo curtain in China. In 1949, the communist forces of Mao Zedong defeated the armies of Chiang Kai-shek, forcing his government to retreat to the island of Taiwan. Then in 1950 the Korean War broke out, eventually killing 1 million Koreans, 250,000 Chinese, and 34,000 Americans. With China, the Soviet Union, and North Korea as its new post-war enemies, the United States suddenly viewed Japan as a country of strategic importance. Washington decided to maintain a stable government in Japan in order to better challenge communism in Asia. The United States left the pre-war bureaucracy in Japan virtually intact, permitting many of its wartime perpetrators to go unpunished. Therefore, while the Nazi regime was overhauled and replaced, and numerous Nazi war criminals were hunted down and brought to trial, many high-ranking wartime Japanese officials returned to power and prospered. In 1957, Japan even elected as prime minister a man who had been imprisoned as a suspected Class A war criminal. At the same time, most if not all of the Nanking Massacre survivors vanished from public view. During the Cold War and the turbulent years of Mao's reign, Nanking, along with the rest of China, remained isolated from much of the international community. The Chinese Communist government not only severed communication with the West for several decades, but expelled many of the remaining foreigners in Nanking, even those who had saved thousands of Chinese lives as administrators of the Nanking Safety Zone. In the summer of 1995, I became one of the first people from the West to capture on videotape the oral testimonies of several survivors of the Rape of Nanking. Sad to say, if I had visited Nanking only a decade earlier, I would have found many sites of the massacre intact, for the city was then a model of historical preservation, and much of its 1930s architecture was still standing. But in the late 1980s and 1990s, the city underwent a frenzy of land speculation and construction, demolishing most of its ancient landscape and replacing it with new luxury hotels, factories, skyscrapers, and apartment buildings under thick blankets of smog. Even much of the famous The Fate of the Survivors 183 Nanking Wall had disappeared, with only a few gates remaining as tourist attractions. If I did not know about the Rape of Nanking before my visit to this teeming, congested, and thriving city, I would have never suspected that it even took place, for the population of the city was at least 10 times greater than it had been immediately after the massacre. Underneath the prosperity, however hidden from view, were the last human links to the past, the elderly survivors of the Nanking Massacre. Scholars in the city guided me to a few of them scattered throughout Nanking. What I found shocked and depressed me. Most lived in dark, squalid apartments cluttered with the debris of poverty and heavy with mildew and humidity. I learned that during the massacre, some had received physical injuries so severe they had been prevented from making a decent living for decades. Most lived in poverty so crushing that even a minimal amount of financial compensation from Japan could have greatly improved the conditions of their lives. Even $100 in reparations from the Japanese to buy an air conditioner could have made a world of difference for many of them. After the war, some of the survivors had clung to the hope that their government would vindicate them by pushing for Japanese reparations and an official apology. This hope, however, was swiftly shattered when the People's Republic of China (PRC), eager to forge an alliance with the Japanese to gain international legitimacy, announced at various times that it had forgiven the Japanese. In 1991, the PRC government even invited the Japanese Prime Minister to visit mainland China. Hearing such news was like being raped a second time, and some saw themselves as the victims of a double betrayal, first by the KMT soldiers, who fled from Nanking before the city collapsed, then by the PRC government, which sold out their futures to the Japanese. According to Karen Parker, an international human rights attorney, the PRC has never signed a treaty with the Japanese relinquishing its right to seek national reparations for wartime crimes, despite its conciliatory statements toward the Japanese. Moreover, Parker claims that, even if such a treaty is made, it cannot, under the principle of jus cogens, infringe upon the right of individual Chinese people to seek reparations for wartime suffering. But most of the survivors I spoke with in Nanking did not know the intricacies of international law, and therefore believed that the PRC had already forfeited their right to seek reparations. Any news of friendly relations between the Chinese and Japanese governments is emotionally devastating to them. One man who was nearly roasted alive by the Japanese during the Rape of Nanking told me that he wept uncontrollably when he heard rumors that the PRC had forgiven the Japanese their past crimes. Another woman whose father was executed during the Nanking Massacre said that her mother collapsed in a faint when the news of the Prime Minister's visit reached her over the radio. Equally sobering were the fates of many of the foreigners who organized the Nanking Safety Zone. Although they sacrificed their energy and health to help the Chinese in Nanking, many of these Westerners never quite got what they deserved from life or posterity. There are no famous books devoted to these forgotten heroes of World War II, and certainly there has been not. All of the survivors from the Rape of Nanking, however, suffered tragic fates. Sometimes I encountered numerous surprise endings, like the conclusion of the life of Commander Tang Shangqi. Despite his fiasco at Nanking, Tang went on to enjoy a charmed existence in China. Things were rough for him at first, because the Nanking debacle left him in foul odor with the Nationalist Party and forced him to return to his home province of Hunan without an official job. But after the Communists came to power, the new leadership embraced Tang, even though he had been a high-ranking military official in the enemy camp. Swiftly Tang rose to prominence, serving as lieutenant government of Hunan, and a member of the National People's Congress, the National Defense Committee, the Chinese National Party Revolutionary Committee, and number of other organizations. Only after serving a long prestigious career in politics did he finally die, on April 6, 1970. A revered official, in his 80s, no movie about them that has captured the imagination of the world public as intensely as Schindler's List. Their spirit lives mainly in a few archives and attics from Berlin to Sunnyvale, and in the minds of a handful of survivors in China, who remember them simply as the living Buddhas who saved Nanking. Most of the Nanking survivors know the deeds of the safety zone leaders, but few are aware of how their lives ultimately played out. The survivors I talked with in China were saddened to learn that some of their protectors eventually endured disgrace and expulsion from China, interrogation and ostracism in their home countries, and irreparable physical and mental wounds, even suicide. Several of these foreign heroes can be considered the belated victims of the Rape of Nanking. The experiences of Minor Cyril Bates and Louis Smythe illustrate how the facts of their heroism during the Nanking Massacre were twisted for political ends. During the Korean War, the PRC distorted the history of the massacre in newspaper articles to depict the Americans as the villains of Nanking, who assisted the Japanese in the carnage. In the local newspaper, Louis Smythe saw articles that accused the safety zone foreigners of giving over the city to the Japanese and turning over thousands of women for raping. In a similar vein, an article in the National Xinhua Yuao charged that the Americans who remained in Nanking in 1937 not only responded well to the imperialist policies of the U.S. government but also protected their companies, churches, schools and residences with the blood and bones of the Chinese people. The author insisted that the International Safety Zone Committee was an organization of imperialists who worked in faithful collusion with the Japan as invaders, and he quoted one Chinese survivor as saying, "The American devils called out the names and the Japanese devils carried out the execution." Pictures of the atrocities were printed with the slogan, "Remember the Nanking Massacre, Stop American Remilitarization of Japan." Such propaganda shocked and frightened Smythe, though his Chinese teacher assured him of his safety. Dr. Smythe, there are 100,000 people in this city left bracket who right bracket know what you people did, the teacher said. There's nothing to worry about. Nevertheless, his days in Nanking were numbered. In 1951, he left his position at Nanking University to join the faculty of Lexington Theological Seminary in Kentucky the following year. Bates also left Nanking, but not before he had been placed under virtual house arrest by the Communists. Smythe and Bates did not suffer as much as some of their colleagues. For several committee members, the massacre took years off their lives. David McGee, son of the Reverend John McGee, is certain that the stress of dealing with the Japanese caused the early death of his father. Other zone leaders endured years of mental agony. For example, Edith Fitch Swap, the daughter of the YMCA secretary George Fitch, said her father had been so traumatized by the Japanese atrocities in Nanking that he often suffered complete amnesia when delivering lectures on the subject. This happened at least twice when Fitch spoke about the Sino-Japanese War in front of large organizations in the United States. Robert Wilson, the Nanking University hospital surgeon, paid the price of Nanking with his health. His widow recalled that while other doctors on the zone committee carefully paced themselves and went to Shanghai at least once a week to catch up on sleep, Wilson recklessly worked nonstop without taking breaks. Surgery consumed most of his energy during the day, while Japanese soldiers interrupted his sleep at night when he was called away from home time, and again to stop a rape in progress. He operated, it seemed, on adrenaline alone. Finally his body rebelled. In 1940 violent seizures, and even a mental collapse, forced Wilson to return to the United States, where he rested for a year, in Santa Barbara, California. He never returned to China, nor did he fully recover from the strain. In the United States, Wilson not only endured both seizures and nightmares but also experienced trouble focusing his eyes in the morning. Many veterans paid the price with her life. The Nanking Massacre took a deeper psychic toll on her than any of the other zone leaders or refugees had realized at the time. Few were aware that under a legend that had grown to mythic proportions was a vulnerable, exhausted woman who never recovered, either emotionally or physically, from daily exposure to Japanese violence. Her last diary entry, dated April 14, 1940, reveals her state of mind. "I'm about at the end of my energy. Can no longer forge ahead and make plans for the work, for on every hand there seem to be obstacles of some kind. I wish I could go on furlough at once, but who will do the thinking for the exp course?" 2 weeks later, she suffered a nervous breakdown. At the bottom of the last page of her diary is a sentence that was written, no doubt, by somebody else. In May 1940, Miss Vautrin's health broke, necessitating her return to the United States. Her niece recalls that Vautrin's colleagues sent her back to the States for medical help, but during the voyage across the Pacific Ocean she tried repeatedly to kill herself. A friend who accompanied Vautrin could barely restrain her from jumping over the side of the ship. Once in the United States, Vautrin entered a psychiatric hospital in Iowa, where she endured electroshock treatment. Upon her release, Vautrin went to work for the United Christian Missionary Society in Indianapolis. Her family in Shepherd, Michigan wanted to visit Vautrin, but she discouraged them by writing that she would be coming to see them soon. A fortnight later, Vautrin was dead. On May 14, 1941, a year to the day she left Nanking, Vautrin sealed the windows and doors of her home with tape, turned on the gas, and committed suicide. Then there was the fate of John Rabe, whose life remained a mystery to historians for years. Before he was summoned back to Germany, Rabe had promised the Chinese in Nanking that he would publicize the Japanese atrocities in his homeland and try to seek an audience with Hermann Göring and even Adolf Hitler. People in Nanking prayed that Rabe's presentation would compel Nazi leaders to exert pressure on the Japanese government to stop the carnage. Before Rabe's departure, a Chinese doctor had asked Rabe to tell the Germans that the Chinese were not communists but peace-loving people who wanted to live in harmony with other nations. After a round of tearful farewell parties, in February 1938, Rabe departed for Germany with a copy of John McGee's film of the Nanking atrocities. After that point in time, he vanished from all the records, and his whereabouts baffled scholars for decades. I was determined to get to the bottom of the story for 2 reasons. First, the irony of a kind-hearted Nazi working with American missionaries to save Chinese refugees from Japanese soldiers was too intriguing for me to ignore. And second, I was convinced that something terrible must have happened to Rabe after he returned to Germany. Rabe, after all, did not appear at the International Military Tribunal of the Far East to testify with his colleagues about the horrors of Nanking. Also, an oral history interview with one of his friends indicated that Rabe had somehow run afoul of Hitler's government. But the friend failed to provide specific details, and by the time I came across the transcript, he was no longer alive to give me the full story. Questions nagged me at every turn. Did Rabe actually show the film and the report to Hitler? Or did he, God forbid, get sucked deeper into the Nazi machinery in Germany and contribute to the extermination of the Jews? This I highly doubted, given his record of heroism at Nanking, but the possibility remained. Perhaps he had been thrown in prison after the war. Or perhaps no one had ever heard from him again because he became a fugitive from the law, living out his remaining years in a Latin American country. I also wondered whether he had kept a personal diary of the Nanking Massacre. But if he kept such papers, they must have been destroyed during the war, incinerated perhaps in an air raid. Otherwise, any such diary should have ended up in archives by now, available to the rest of the world. Still, I figured that it would not hurt to write some letters to Germany to see what I could find. I possessed one important clue about Rabe. He had been apprenticed in Hamburg around the turn of the century. Perhaps he had been bombed there and still had family in the city. Somehow I had to establish contact with a key source in Hamburg. I turned to an old friend for help. John Taylor, whom scholars called a national treasure, had worked more than half a century at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and knew just about every serious historian in the world. If there was an expert somewhere on the planet who had studied the history of the German community in China during World War II, Taylor would probably know who he was. Taylor suggested that I contact the historian Charles Burdick of Femdale, California. Burdick in turn suggested that I write to the city historian of Hamburg. He also gave me the address of Martha Bagman, a friend of his, and, he assured me, a lovely lady, who was not only well connected in the city, but generous with her help. Within a few days I wrote to Bagman about the Rabe mystery, as well as to the editor of the largest newspaper in Hamburg, hoping that the latter would in a notice about my search. Then, expecting no immediate reply from either of them, I turned my attention to other things. To my surprise, a letter came back from Bagman right away. Through a fortuitous chain of events, she had already located Rabe's family. "I am happy I could help you, and it was not so very difficult," she wrote on April 26, 1996. First of all, I wrote to Pastor Müller in Bavaria, who collected the whereabouts of all former Germans in China. He promptly rang me up the other day, telling me the names of Dr. Otto Rabe, son of John Rabe, and his sister Margarete. She enclosed in her letter a message from Ursula Reinhardt, Rabe's granddaughter in Berlin. From that moment on, things moved swiftly. Ursula Reinhardt, I learned, had been bombed in China. As a little girl, she even visited Nanking only months before the city fell. She was Rabe's favorite granddaughter. To my delight, Reinhardt proved endlessly helpful to my inquiries, and sent me many long letters. With handwritten text, photographs, and news articles, Reinhardt filled in some of the missing details of Rabe's life. Rabe kept his promise to the Chinese that he would inform the German authorities of the Japanese horrors in Nanking. On April 15, he and his wife returned to Germany, where he received numerous accolades for his achievements. In Berlin, the German Secretary of State officially commended Rabe for his work in China. Rabe was awarded the Service Cross of the Red Cross Order. In Stuttgart, he was further decorated, receiving the Silver Poster for Service to Germany Award and the Diamond Order Award on a red, white, and blue necklace from the Chinese government. That May, Rabe publicized the Nanking Massacre by lecturing and showing John McGee's film all over Berlin, speaking before packed audiences at the Siemens Company, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Association for the Far East, and the War Ministry. Rabe failed to secure an audience with Adolf Hitler, however, and so on June 8 he sent a letter to the Führer, along with a copy of the film and a typewritten report on the Rape of Nanking. But if Rabe had expected a sympathetic response from Hitler, he was gravely mistaken. A few days later, 2 members of the Gestapo arrived on his doorstep to arrest him. Ursula Reinhardt was there when it happened. She was 7 years old, trying on a pair of roller skates near the door, when she saw 2 official-looking men, in black uniforms with white lapels, take Rabe away to a waiting car. My grandfather looked embarrassed, and the 2 men very severe and stiff, so that I didn't even dare hug him farewell. Rabe was interrogated for several hours at Gestapo headquarters. The Gestapo released him only after his employer, Karl Friedrich von Siemen, vouched for his character and promised them that Rabe would refrain from talking of the Japanese so openly. Rabe was warned never to lecture, discuss, or write on the subject again, and most of all, never to show John McGee's film to anyone. After Rabe's release, the Siemens Company immediately sent him abroad, probably for his own protection. For the next few months, Rabe worked in Afghanistan, helping German nationals leave the country, by way of Turkey. In October, the German government returned his report, but kept the copy of John McGee's film. Rabe never found out whether Hitler read the report, or saw the film, although his family today is convinced that he did. The German government informed Rabe that his report was sent to the Ministry of Economics, where it was read by the highest circles of government, but that he should not expect any change in German foreign policy toward Japan because of it. The next few years proved nightmarish for Rabe. The fate of the survivors, 191 men, was bombed out, and the Russian invasion of Berlin reduced his family to poverty. Ursula Reinhardt is convinced that they survived only because they were living in the British, not the Soviet, section of Berlin. Rabe continued to work sporadically for the Siemens Company, translating economic correspondence into English. But the low wage was barely enough to keep his family alive. The immediate post-war period for Rabe must have been one long string of angry accusations. First, he was arrested by the Soviets, who interrogated him for 3 days and nights before the unrelenting glare of Klieg lights. Then he was arrested by the British, who grilled him for an entire day, but later gave him a work permit. The permit, however, had little value for Rabe because the Siemens Company still did not have a permanent position for him. The final humiliation came when a German acquaintance denounced Rabe and propelled him into a long, drawn-out denazification process. He had to pay for his own legal defense, in the process losing his work permit and depleting his savings and energy. Crowded into one tiny room, with his family fighting cold and hunger, Rabe was forced to sell, piece by piece, his beloved collection of Chinese artwork to the American Army in order to buy beans, bread, and soap. Malnutrition caused him to succumb to skin disease, while sorrow and stress all but destroyed his health. In Nanking he was a legend, but in Germany he was a dying man. Excerpts from Rabe's diary reveal his state of mind. In 1945-46, there is no job for me, at Siemens I'm unemployed. According to the military government, I must give my standard life policies to be registered in Spandau a district in the northwest of Berlin at the Stadtkontorbank. The policies of over £1,027.19, the rest of £5,000, for which I worked and saved so many years, are with Gretel Margarethi, his daughter in Bund. As far as I can see, this money is lost now. Last Sunday I was with Mommy Dora Rabe, John Rabe's wife in the Xantener Straft Rabe's bombed apartment They broke the door in our cellar and stole my typewriter, our radio, and more Mio fats. Now Mommy weighs only 44 kg. We have grown very meager. The summer comes to an end. What will winter bring? Where will we get fuel, food, and work? I'm now translating Tim Perley's What War Means a book of documents about the Nanking Massacre At the moment this brings no money, but perhaps I shall get a better food ration card. All Germans suffer as we do. We suffer hunger, and hunger again. I had nothing to tell, so I didn't write down anything. In addition to our meager meal, we ate acorn flour soup. Mommy collected the acorns secretly, in autumn. Now as the provisions come to an end, day after day we ate stinging nettle. The young leaves taste like spinach. Yesterday my petition to get denazified was rejected. Though I saved the lives of 250,000 Chinese people, as the head of the International Committee of the Nanking Safety Zone, my request was refused because I was for a short time the leader of the Ortsgruppenleiter district of the Nstap in Nanking, and a man of my intelligence must not have sought membership of this party. I am going to appeal if they don't give me any possibility to work at SSW, the Siemens Schuckert work, the name of Rabe's company I don't know what to live on. So I must go on to fight, and I am so tired. At the moment I'm questioned every day by the police. If I had heard of any atrocities of the Nazis in China I wouldn't have entered the Stab, and any of my opinions, as a German man, had differed with the opinion of the foreigners in Nanking. The English, the Americans, Danes, etc. in Nanking would have chosen me chairman of the International Security Committee in Nanking. In Nanking I was the living Buddha for hundreds of thousands of people, and here I am a pariah and outcast. Oh, if I could only be cured of my homesickness. On June the 3rd finally I was denazified by the Denazifying Commission of the British sector in Charlottenburg. The judgment runs: though you were deputy leader of the district of Nanstap, and though after your return to Germany you did not resign membership of Nanstap left bracket Ursula Reinhardt notes that doing so would have been suicide right bracket. The commission decided to sustain your objection because of your successful humanitarian work in China, etc. With this, the nerve torture finally came to an end. I was congratulated by many friends and directors of the SSW, and given a holiday by the firm to recover from the strain. Today mommy is out with one of our Chinese wooden idols to go to Dr. Krebs, who now and then provided us with food and was in love with this idol. A Chinese carpet, a present from Kong, we gave to Mrs. Topfer for 300 weights of potatoes. By 1948 news of Rabe's plight had reached China. When the Nanking city government announced to its people that Rabe needed help, the response was tremendous, almost reminiscent of the conclusion of Frank Capra's classic film, It's a Wonderful Life. Within a matter of days, the survivors of the massacre raised for Rabe's support $100 million in Chinese dollars, roughly equivalent at the time to $2,000 in US dollars, no small amount, in 1948. In March that year the mayor of Nanking traveled to Switzerland, where he bought large quantities of milk powder, sausages, tea, coffee, beef butter, and jam to be delivered to Rabe in 4 huge packages. From June 1948 until the fall of the capital, to the communists, the people of Nanking also mailed Rabe a bundle of food each month to express their heartfelt thanks for his leadership of the International Safety Zone. The Kuomintang government even offered Rabe free housing in China and a lifelong pension if he ever chose to return. The packages were a godsend for Rabe and his family. In June 1948 the city of Nanking learned just how badly Rabe had needed them when they received from him several letters of profuse thanks, letters that remain to this day in Chinese archives. Before the packages arrived, the family had been collecting wild weeds, which the children would eat with soup. The adults subsisted on barely more than dry bread. But at the time, when Rabe wrote his letters to Nanking, even bread had disappeared from the Berlin market, making the packages all the more precious to them. The entire family was grateful for the support of the Nanking people, and Rabe himself wrote that the gesture had restored his faith in life. Rabe died from an artery stroke in 1950. Before his death, he left behind a written legacy of his work in China. More than 2,000 pages of documents on the Rape of Nanking that he had meticulously typed, numbered, bound, and even illustrated. These documents included his and other foreigners' eyewitness reports, newspaper articles, radio broadcasts, telegrams, and photographs of the atrocities. No doubt Rabe recognized the historical value of this record. Perhaps he even predicted its future publication. A decade after his death, Ursula Reinhardt's mother found the diaries among his papers and offered to give them to her, but the offer came at a bad time. Reinhardt was pregnant and immersed in school examinations. More significantly, she was afraid to read the gruesome contents of the diaries. When she politely declined the offer, John Rabe's son, Dr. Otto Rabe, inherited the papers instead. With him, they remained unknown to the world public, and even to German historians, for half a century. There are a number of possible reasons for this secrecy. According to the Reinhardts, John Rabe himself had warned his son not to disclose the existence of the diaries. The treatment he had endured under the Gestapo may very well have had something to do with his caution. But there was a more fundamental reason for the family's reluctance to advertise the diary's existence. Rabe's previous status as a Nazi raised understandable concerns among some members of his family, and in the immediate post-war years, it was simply not politically correct to publish the documents of a Nazi or boast about his accomplishments, however worthy they might have been. The other Nazis on the Nanking International Safety Zone Committee kept quiet about their records as well. Shortly after the discovery of the rape papers, I learned of the existence of the fate of the survivors 195, another Nazi diary of the Rape of Nanking, entitled Days of Fate in Nanking, by Christian Kruger. His son, Peter Kruger, had found a copy of the diary in his father's desk after his death at the age of 90. It was fortunate, he wrote, that my letter reached him when it did. If it had arrived only a month earlier, he would have told me that his father had possessed only a few newspaper articles on the subject. To this day he wonders why his father never told him about the Rape of Nanking, or the diary. I suspect the reason is linked to Rabe's downfall and persecution in Germany after he sent the report on the Great Rape to Hitler. In fact, at the bottom of the diary is a handwritten scrawl, no doubt Kruger's, that warns, contrary to the current opinions of the Hitler government. Consequently, one had to be very careful with this. It was Ursula Reinhardt who finally told the world about Rabe's heroic efforts. When my letter reached her, she decided that the diaries merited closer examination. She borrowed the documents from her uncle and steeled herself to read them. The contents were violent, beyond her wildest expectations, causing her to reel from descriptions of women gang raped by Japanese soldiers in the public streets of Chinese victims burned alive in Nanking. Months later, Reinhardt remained so horrified by her grandfather's report that she did not hesitate to tell a reporter from the Renmin Raibao People's Daily her honest opinion of the Nanking Massacre, an opinion certain to provoke controversy. That the Japanese torture of their victims in Nanking surpassed even the Nazis in cruelty, and that the Japanese were far worse than Adolf Hitler himself. Reinhardt worried about the implications of releasing the diaries to the world. She saw the diaries as political dynamite with the potential to wreck Sino-Japanese relations. But at my urging, and also at the urging of Xiao Tsuping, a past president of the alliance, in the memory of victims of the Nanking Massacre, who worked for the United Nations, she decided to make the diaries public. She spent 15 hours photocopying them. Xiao, who was fearful that right-wing Japanese might break into her house and destroy the diaries, or offer the family large sums of money to buy up the originals, hastily flew Ursula Reinhardt and her husband to New York City, where copies of the diaries were donated to the Yale Divinity School Library at a press conference that was first announced by a prominent story in the New York Times and then covered by Peter Jennings of ABC TV, CNN, and other world media organizations on December 12, 1996, the 59th anniversary of the fall of Nanking. Historians were unanimous in their proclamation of the diaries' value. Many saw the diaries as more conclusive proof that the Rape of Nanking really did occur, and as an account told from the perspective of a Nazi, they found it fascinating. Rabe's account added authenticity to the American reports of the massacre, not only because a Nazi would have lacked the motive to fabricate stories of the atrocities, but also because Rabe's records included translations of the American diaries from English to German that matched the originals word for word. In the PRC, scholars announced to the Renmin Raibao that the documents verified and corroborated much of the existing Chinese source material on the massacre. In the United States, William Kirby, a professor of Chinese history at Harvard University, told the New York Times, "It's an incredibly gripping and depressing narrative, done very carefully with an enormous amount of detail and drama. It will reopen this case in a very important way, in that people can go through the day-by-day account and add 100 to 200 stories to what is popularly known. Even Japanese historians pronounced the rape finding important." Kasahara Tokushi, a professor of modern Chinese history at Utsunomiya University, testified to the Asahi Shimbun. What makes this report significant is the fact that not only was it compiled by a German, an ally of Japan, Rabe submitted the report to Hitler to make him aware of the atrocities occurring in Nanking. The fact that Rabe, who was a vice president of the Nazi Party, entreated Hitler, the top leader of a Japanese ally, to intervene testifies to the tremendous scale of the massacre. Haruiku Hiko, a professor of modern Japanese history at the University of Chiba, added, "The meaning of this report is significant in the sense that a German, whose country was the fate of the survivors 197 lied with Japan, depicts the atrocity of Nanking objectively. In that sense, it has more value as a historical document than the testimony of the American pastor. At the time, Germany was not sure which side to take, either Japan's or China's. However, Ribbentrop's inauguration as foreign minister fostered Germany's alliance with Japan. It is amazing how brave he was by trying to let Hitler know of the atrocity in Nanking at such a critical time. The Forgotten Holocaust. A second rape. Is there a child today, in any part of the United States, and perhaps in many other parts of the world, who has not seen the gruesome pictures of the gas chambers at Auschwitz or read at least part of the haunting tale of the young and Frank? Indeed, at least in the United States, most school children are also taught about the devastating effects of the atomic bombs the United States dropped over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But ask most Americans' children and adults alike, including highly educated adults, about the Rape of Nanking, and you will learn that most have never been told what happened in Nanking 60 years ago. A prominent government historian admitted to me that the subject had never once come up in all her years of gradu. The Rape of Nanking ate school. A Princeton-educated lawyer told me sheepishly that she was not even aware that China and Japan had been at war. Her knowledge of the Pacific conflict of World War II had been limited to Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima. The ignorance extends even to Asian Americans in this country. One of them revealed her woeful grasp of geography and history when she asked me, Nanking, what was that? A dynasty, an event that 60 years ago made front page news in American newspapers, appears to have vanished almost without a trace. Hollywood has not produced a mainstream movie about the massacre, even though the story contains dramatic elements similar to those of Schindler's List. And until recently, most American novelists and historians have also chosen not to write about it. After hearing such remarks, I became terrified that the history of 300,000 murdered Chinese might disappear just as they themselves had disappeared under Japanese occupation, and that the world might actually one day believe the Japanese politicians who have insisted that the Rape of Nanking was a hoax and a fabrication, that the massacre never happened at all. By writing this book, one forced myself to delve into not only history, but historiography, to examine the forces of history and the process by which history is made. What keeps certain events in history and assigns the rest to oblivion? Exactly how does an event like the Rape of Nanking vanish from Japan's and even the world's collective memory? One reason information about the Rape of Nanking has not been widely disseminated clearly lies in the post-war differences in how Germany and Japan handled their wartime crimes. Perhaps more than any other nation in history, the Germans have incorporated into their post-war political identity the concession that the wartime government itself, not just individual Nazis, was guilty of war crimes. The Japanese government, however, has never forced itself, or Japanese society, to do the same. As a result, although some bravely fight to force Japanese society to face the painful truth, many in Japan continue to treat the war crimes as the isolated acts of individual soldiers, or even as events that simply did not occur. The Forgotten Holocaust. A second rape. 201. In Japan, competing stories of what happened during World War II continue to appear. According to a currently popular revisionist view, the country bears no responsibility for the wholesale murder of civilians anywhere during the war. The Japanese fought the war to ensure its own survival and to free Asia from the grip of Western imperialism. Indeed, in return for its noble efforts, Japan itself ended up as the ultimate victim at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This soothing perception of history still finds its way into Japanese history textbooks, which have either ignored the massacre at Nanking altogether, or put a decidedly Japanese spin on the actions of the military. At the far end of the political spectrum, Japanese ultranationalists have threatened everything from lawsuits to death, even assassination, to silence opponents who suggest that these textbooks are not telling the next generation the real story. But it is not just fanatical fringe groups that are trying to rewrite history. In 1990, Ishihara Shintaro, a leading member of Japan's conservative Liberal Democratic Party, and the author of best-selling books such as The Japan That Can Say No, told a Playboy interviewer, "People say that the Japanese made a Holocaust there left bracket in Nanking right bracket, but that is not true. It is a story made up by the Chinese. It has tarnished the image of Japan, but it is a lie. Naturally, this statement enraged scholars and journalists around the world. One proclaimed that Japan's denial of the Rape of Nanking would be politically the same as German denial of the Holocaust. But the denunciations failed to silence Ishihara, who responded with a furious stream of counterattacks. In his rebuttals, Ishihara, in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, asserted that the world never learned about the Nanking Massacre until the International Military Tribunal of the Far East put people on trial for their role in it. That neither Japanese war correspondents nor Western reporters wrote about the massacre as it was occurring. That the New York Times correspondent Frank Tillman Durden failed to witness any massacre. And that the Episcopalian minister John McGee saw only one person killed. The Forgotten Holocaust. A second rape 203. By the 1990s, John McGee was of course no longer alive to defend himself, but his son, David McGee, made an effort to disprove Ishihara's statements. He gave interviews to the media and attended conferences on the Nanking Massacre, at which he read from his father's papers and displayed the actual camera his father used to film Japanese atrocities. Frank Tillman Durden was alive, and he took direct action. Stepping out of retirement in San Diego to hold a press conference to refute Ishihara's remarks, Durden explained to reporters that he had indeed written an article in 1937 that described the countryside from Shanghai to Nanking as peaceful, but that this article was written 2 months before the Japanese started their advance on Nanking. Ishihara's other statements are readily refutable. Contemporaneous reports of the rape appeared in dozens of Western newspapers, and even Japanese newspapers ran detailed stories about the massacre. As for Durden, his articles were not only contemporaneous but published on the front pages of the New York Times. John McGee's letters contained descriptions like, "The raping of the women has been beyond description or imagination, and there were dead bodies in every street and alley in the city, so far as I could tell, and I went around quite extensively including Ziakwan." Not to be stopped, however, Ishihara went on to suggest that the Chinese claims of a massacre at Nanking helped influence the U.S. decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As each refutation of his earlier claims made it impossible for Ishihara to repeat them, he shifted his position slightly, but on one point, he remained inflexible. Even if the Germans had apologized for killing the Jews, that did not mean that the Japanese should do the same. Under no circumstances should the Japanese ever admit they were guilty of any wrongdoing. Ishihara's career remained intact despite the Playboy interview, but eventually others were not so lucky. One man who was sucked into the vortex of controversy was General Nagano Shigeto. In the spring of 1994, within days of his appointment to the cabinet-level position of Justice Minister, he gave an interview to the Mainichi Shimbun newspaper that turned out to be political suicide. "I think the Nanking Massacre and the rest was a fabrication," he told the newspaper. "I was in Nanking immediately afterwards." He went on to call the Korean comfort women licensed prostitutes, not sex slaves, and to argue that Japan had no choice but to go to war, because it was in danger of being crushed. The violent reaction to his statements across Asia forced Nagano to resign in disgrace. In September 1986, Fujio Masayuki, the Japanese Minister of Education, sabotaged his career when he declared that the Rape of Nanking was just a part of war. In an interview with Bundae Shunju magazine, Fujio defended the actions of the Japanese during the Nanking Massacre, and claimed that the number of dead had been exaggerated. He also said that Korea was partly to blame for its annexation by Japan in 1910, that Korea willingly accepted colonization, and that the Tokyo War Crimes Trial was racial revenge meant to rob Japan of her power. Though Fujio made these comments only to restore the Japanese spirit through history and tradition, they cost him his job. That month, Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro dismissed him from his post. Okuno Saisuke, who had been the prefectural director of the notorious Kempeitai, the secret Japanese military police during the war, rose after the war to become the Japanese Minister of Justice, and even the Minister of Education. By 1988, Okuno had become the Japanese Land Agency chief and the third most senior member of the cabinet. But Okuno's undoing came that spring, when he visited the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where Japanese Class A war criminals are enshrined and worshipped, and revealed his true attitudes about World War II. There was no intention of aggression, Okuno told reporters. The white race made Asia into a colony, but only Japan has been blamed. Who was the aggressor country? It was the white race. I don't see why Japanese are called militarists and airsores. His statements provoked an uproar across Asia, prompting Okuno to adjust his wording. I didn't say Japan wasn't an aggressor. One said it wasn't the only aggressor. By May, Okuno had been forced to resign, but he remained unrepentant to the end. He had stepped down, Okuno said, only under pressure from the government, not because he wished to retract his statements. In August 1994, Sakura Ishin, the Director General of the Japanese Environmental Agency, remarked that Japan did not go to war with the intent to commit aggression. In response to China's angry protests, a PRC Foreign Ministry spokesman announced that the Chinese government regrets that, once again, a Japanese cabinet minister has brazenly made remarks which distort historical facts. Murayama Tomiichi ended up apologizing for Sakurai's remarks. He also rebuked Sakurai by calling the remarks inappropriate and forced the Director General to hold a midnight press conference to retract his statement. In 1995, Hashimoto Ryutaro, the Minister for International Trade and Industry and a powerful man in the Liberal Democratic Party, he would later become the Prime Minister of Japan, announced that it was Japan's intention only to fight the United States, Britain, and others during World War II. While Japan was aggressive toward China, he said, it really had no intention of invading other Asian countries. The official denials continued even as this book was going to press. Kajiyama Sriku, the Japanese chief cabinet secretary, outraged several Asian countries when he stated that the sex slaves and rape victims of the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II were not slaves at all, but willingly engaged in prostitution. In January 1997, he proclaimed that the comfort women of the Japanese army went for the money and were no different from the Japanese prostitutes who were working legally in Japan at the time. Amazingly, these comments came on the eve of weekend summit talks between Japanese Prime Minister Hashimoto Ryutaro and South Korean President Kim Young-sam, both of whom expressed deep anger over Kajiyama's remarks. Kajiyama later made a gesture to apologize, though he infuriated critics because the apology seemed insulting and insincere. The cabinet secretary regretted that his comments caused some unpleasantness at the Japan-South Korean summit and the forgotten Holocaust. A second Rape 205 misunderstanding among the South Korean people, but he refused to retract his original comments. This was not the first time Kajiyama's mouth had landed him in trouble. In 1990, he was forced to resign from his position as Japanese Justice Minister after comparing African Americans to prostitutes who come in and ruin a neighborhood. The textbook controversy, perhaps one of the most sinister aspects of the malaise in Japanese education, is the deliberate obstruction of important historical information about World War II through textbook censorship. Almost from birth, Japanese children fight for footholds in the slippery pyramid of education, striving to reach the tip, which is admission to Todai, or Tokyo University. There are cram elementary schools to get into the right high school, where kids study from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Cram preparatory kindergartens to ensure admission into the right elementary school. Even exclusive maternity wards that guarantee babies a ticket into the right nursery school. But despite the examination hell for which the Japanese are famous, what do their school children learn about World War II? Very little, as it turns out. The entire Japanese education system suffers from selective amnesia, for not until 1994 were Japanese school children taught that Hirohito's army was responsible for the deaths of at least 20 million Allied soldiers and Asian civilians during World War II. In the early 1990s, a newspaper article quoted a Japanese high school teacher who claimed that his students were surprised to learn that Japan had been at war with the United States. The first thing they wanted to know was, who won? How does this happen? All textbooks used in Japan's elementary and secondary schools must first be approved by the Japanese Ministry of Education. Critics in Japan note that social studies textbooks come under the heaviest scrutiny. 4x World Reduced caret equals ERSSSHH, war erudies, or he forced evacuations of Knees and 7 prisoners to labor camps in Japan DK Rinai. Not been for Fotif Jafet, Adam, had Japanese historian Sluro JDT asterisk, and 1965 the mem. This lawsuit was the OD Japanese governed Philwill is at work P, but und asterisk H power army, unilaterally massacred DRH, T asterisk that the Japan Nation TH7, Chinese immediately after the occupation. This passage should be revised so that it il preted in such a way asterisk 111s not longer, while BAULINVM